and crawling up on the land, and this whole scenario which they have of how life came about. It is something which is more fantastic and more mythical than anything found in the religious books explaining how human beings and how the world got here. It is, in fact, another religion which has its own explanation of human beings, this world that we live in, what we're here for. We're not here for any real purpose. This is just the evolutionary principle, evolving things for the better without any direction, yet having direction. And what we can say ends up being the God for those who reject God is the God of chance. The God of chance. Because when we ask these people who don't believe in God, we ask them, why it is that you have a good life and other people have a bad life. You've got a good job, so-and-so has a bad job. They would say it was my good luck. Why did he have a bad job? Because it's his bad luck. And if you look through his whole day, from the time he or she wakes up in the morning to the time they go to bed at night, you'll see everything happening throughout their lives as being a result of good luck and bad luck. So, ultimately, their God is the God of chance. Good luck or bad luck. And in modern times, especially from the 50s onwards, we had another phenomenon developing amongst people who rejected the concept of God but tried to find another way to explain the way things are and to give meaning to life here. And that was the belief in the flying saucers, the UFOs. As a couple of university professors, Benson Saylor and Charles Ziegler, professors of anthropology, they published a book called The Roswell Myth, which is, Roswell is this town in New Mexico where a flying saucer was supposed to have crashed nearby in 1947, and supposedly the American military covered it up, and there were some little aliens, and from this the myth about flying saucers developed on a large scale, and you find till today, this year, last year, number of movies, books and things being put out about Roswell. So they said, at the core of the Roswell myth is a secular way to give the universe meaning. This myth becomes a secular way to give the universe meaning, and humanity a renewed place at the head of the table. Not only are the skies populated with superhuman beings, but their visits are evidence that we are interesting. Saylor said that the Roswell myth is an effort to put enchantment back into nature. After human beings had removed God from creation, nature just became blind forces. In a desire to give it meaning again, this belief in the UFOs took off, and it became so much of a religion that we know last year some 50-odd members of one of the UFO cults committed suicide so that they could spiritually rejoin or join up with the spacecraft that was hiding behind a comet which was passing through our solar system at the time. The fact of the matter, having looked at these various arguments, is that the belief in God is the logical belief. And it is the disbelief in God which is illogical. Now, with the atheist thrust in the 20th century, belief in God became classified as irrational. This was an irrational belief, going against reason. And it is reason, according to them, which dictates that God doesn't exist. However, if one looks at their arguments, one can only conclude that it is logical to believe in God, and in fact illogical to disbelieve. And it is on those who disbelieve to prove, not on us who believe to prove that God exists. It is on them, the disbelievers, to prove that God does not exist, because it is their arguments which are in fact illogical. Logic tells us that where we see design, there is a designer. And this is the most common argument presented in the Quran, where Allah invites the creation to look at the camels, at the mountains, how they are set up, how they are organized, etc., to reflect that there has to be an organizer behind this. It's not going to be there and with this type of structure, etc., without there having been an organizer, that it would happen by chance, by accident. When a person walks on a beach and they see a footprint in the sand, the first thought which comes to them is not that the waves of the sea have come up onto the sand and sunken into the sand, creating the impression of a footprint. How amazing that is. No, this is not the first thought that comes to a person's mind. The first thought is that somebody walked here. The ancient Arabs used to say that camel dung indicates the camel. Meaning that when you're walking out on the desert and you come across a piece of camel dung, you don't start reflecting how this camel dung appeared here. Did it come out of the sand somehow? Some things in the sand created it? And no. You see camel dung, you assume a camel walked by. This is logic. This is reason. And if we can do that with camel dung and a footprint in the sand, the human being, who is far more complex, far more intricate, to assume that he came into being, that this world came into being by accident, is as foolish as that person standing on the desert wondering where this camel dung came from. So, the questions that does God exist or does God not exist, this question is really one raised by those who deny their very nature, deny logic, deny reason. Everything around them points to the existence of a creator. For them not to accept it is a deliberate denial of that knowledge which is within each and every human being. The reason which God has given them. They have become irrational. This is why the real question for us, or for human beings, is not so much, is there a God or isn't there a God, but who is God? This is the big question. This is the question that has puzzled human beings over the ages. Because we said the vast majority of human beings believe there is a God. But the question is, who is that God? And we find in the various societies, the various communities, tribes, nations, etc., a variety of answers as to who is God. Now, the essential difference between all of these answers presented by the various religions and systems and the answer given by Islam is expressed in another question. Did God become man? Did God become His creation? Because when we look at the arguments of all of the various systems that believe in God, but have different answers as to who is God, we find that the vast majority of them all believe that God at some point in time became His creation. Either He became a man, or He became an animal, or He became some aspect of His creation. The sun, the moon, whatever. And it is really only in Islam that we find the answer is no. God did not become His creation. God is the creator, and everything besides Him is His creation. He is not His creation, nor is His creation Him. Those who argue that God became a man, that God became His creation, usually argue from the point that God is able to do all things, because when we talk about God, we talk about certain attributes which we give to God. That God is eternal, He is without beginning, without end, He is all-knowing, all-powerful, etc. And He is able to do all things. And this is a part of Islamic belief. It's repeated throughout the Quran in so many places. Inna Allaha ala kulli shayin qadir. Allah is able to do all things. So, those who argue that God became man, and once we say that God became a man, we would argue that why do you want to stop there? And became a man, why not say became many men? Or became animals, etc. Because once you open the door that God became a man, this is opening the door for God to become His creation, in whatever form people choose to perceive Him. They argue that God is able to do all things, so why couldn't He become a man? Now, for those who take this question superficially, they would find that they were forced to accept this argument. Yes, if God is able to do all things, then why couldn't He become a man? But the fact is that when we say that God is able to do all things, we're not talking about things which make God less than God, make God no longer God. We're talking about, when we talk about God is able to do all things from the Islamic perspective, it means all things that are in keeping with His attributes of being God. All things which befit Him as God. And excluded from this are what are called the absurdities. All of the things which would make God less than God. For example, if we say that God is without beginning, to then ask, can God be born, is an absurdity. Because we have already said that God is without beginning. So to ask, can God be born, contradicts the basic belief that one has about God. But, according to the argument that God is able to do all things, one would have to say yes. He's able to do all things. Though He is without beginning, He can be born. But this is ridiculous. Similarly, we know that God, one of the attributes of God is that He's eternal, without end. And again, to ask, can God die? It's a ridiculous question. But those who want to include everything in God being able to do all things would have to accept the fact that yes, God could die. Though inside themselves it is illogical. It goes against reason. Similarly, to say that God became a man, that God became His creation, is absurd. Because God is the creator. God is the creator. For Him to become His creation, creation is in need of a creator. So it means that God would become if God became his creation, he would then be in need of a creator. He could no longer be the creator. And whoever created him, that's who God is, not him. So we see that the argument that God became a man is an illogical argument. It goes against reason. It goes against revelation. True revelation confirms that God is the creator and he is not his creation. He does not become his creation. He did not become his creation, and he never will become his creation. So in summing up the presentation this evening, which addresses the oneness of God. The belief in God, we said, is logical. And it is in fact illogical not to believe in God. The existence of the belief in God in the vast majority of tribes around this world, no matter how primitive, so-called primitive they may be, confirms that it is something essential to human beings. It is a part of their created nature to realize and to understand this, to know that God exists. And Greek philosophers of the past argued from pure logic that God exists. The arguments that God doesn't exist are not only ridiculous, they also represent a small element of individuals who reject reason and have sought to propagate the idea that there is no God, to perpetuate or to develop a system. This was the atheist systems known as communism and systems of the like. This was a part of their own arguments for explaining a future which they proposed, a mythological future where a new human being would arise out of this communist system who would be angelic. This new human being would only take from the fruit of the labor of human beings what they needed, and they would work according to their ability. This was the communist man, the ideal, the dream that they had. And it was a myth. It never came into being, and the communist systems have fallen apart, and religion in these areas have reasserted themselves. Belief in God is logical. It is affirmed by everything we see around us. Human experience confirms that wherever there is something having a design, there was behind them or behind that thing a designer. The question, as I mentioned, is not so much as is there a God, but who is God? Was God his creation? Did God become his creation? Will his creation become God? These are the questions that Islam answers with an emphatic no. The Creator God is not his creation. Everything that exists is by his will. It was created out of nothing, not by nothing, but out of nothing. God, by his command, created things from nothing. And it is an inability on the part of some human beings to fathom this act of creation, which led them to believe that this world is an extension of God. When they looked at human beings and they saw human beings creating from things which already existed. And they said, well, okay, in the beginning was God, and then God created. Then he must have created things from himself. So you have the Hindu belief that people are in different castes.